This is the second part of an analysis of the talk, The Myth of the Aryan Invasion, given by David Frawley, in which Frawley presents evidence that India was where the world's first civilization appeared. If you didn't see part 1, I think you should go back and watch it first before you do this one, as you'll be able to understand what's going on in this one better if you do. I'll leave a link in the description below, and then come on back. In that first part, I showed how genetic and linguistic evidence did not support Frawley's claims, but he asserted that priority should be given to the literary, geological, and archaeological evidence. So we have to give him a chance to present his arguments in those areas. Unfortunately, I think we will find, as we discuss them, that his supports do not hold up as well as he thinks they do. Myths of ancient history is aimed at dispelling common misconceptions about the past. If you're interested in ancient history, lost civilizations, and secrets from antiquity, I encourage you to pause this video and subscribe to the channel, because you will get plenty of that kind of material. And if you find this particular video valuable, please hit the like button and comment below with your favorite takeaway. And feel free to ask any clarification questions that you may have. So, what are the literary, geological, and archaeological evidences for Indian priority, that is, that India's civilization came first, and the out of India hypothesis that all civilizations of the world came from India? Let me be clear at the outset that I enthusiastically accept the evidence for the great antiquity of civilization in South Asia. You can't ignore the remarkable material remains of the Harappan, or Indus River Valley, civilization of the Bronze Age, which archaeologists have dated as lasting from the late 4th to the early 2nd millennium BCE, making it one of the oldest civilizations in the world. And it was not a transplant from somewhere else, but it was indigenous. Let me also say that I am equally impressed by the complex, sophisticated society reflected in the Hindu holy books written in Sanskrit called the Vedas, and I do not view that Vedic culture as primitive or backwards or weak or simplistic. I just cannot go as far as Frawley, who posits that the Arya, or Aryans, the people linguists call the Indo-Aryans, the ones who composed the Vedas, were the inhabitants of the Harappan civilization, and that the Aryans were the progenitors of all Indo-Europeans, and that South Asia is where the first civilization on Earth appeared, and that no one migrated into India throughout the entire Bronze Age and early Iron Age. Those are the claims that just do not stand up to the evidence. Now, as I go forward, I will do my best to steelman Frawley's arguments. That means consider them in the strongest form that I can. And then I will show you the problems that nevertheless are inherent in his arguments. I want you to understand why the consensus in historical scholarship is what it is.
As the excavation of these so-called Harappan sites has continued, very many interesting things have been found. They constitute the largest urban civilization in the ancient world in terms of size. You could take the Indus-Saraswati civilization and put all of Egypt and Mesopotamia together and still have extra room left over. We talk of Sumeria as the cradle of civilization. All of Sumeria could be put in a small portion of Gujarat, by that whole Surat region. There'd be plenty of room left over. So much larger in size, much more populated. It had probably 5-10 times the population of the Mesopotamian cultures, and a greater uniformity of building practices and artifacts, arts, and crafts.
Okay, so here he is establishing the great size of the Harappan, or Indus River Valley civilization. As we continue, he'll also try to establish the great size of the Vedic literary tradition, and then say that we should assume therefore they are connected, because they're both large. By extolling the size of the Harappan civilization in comparison with others, he also seems to be implying it's older than the others. But what does the fact that the Indus River Valley civilization was large and uniform have to do with whether it was first? Does that make sense to you? Like, oh, well, if it's the biggest, then it's got to be the first? Cities grow at different rates, and they also stop growing, and they may grow and get smaller, right? Since civilizations grow at different speeds, you can't say that the largest necessarily was the first one to ever come into existence. It's just not a reasonable supposition. And when exactly was it supposedly the largest?
The Vedas are by far the largest ancient literature we have from the ancient world. What the Greeks have preserved is much later and much smaller. What the Bible and those traditions are much smaller. What you have in the Mesopotamian culture, what they found is only a few isolated texts. We have by far the largest literature from the ancient world, but preserved throughout history with extensive commentaries and redactions.
Again, I don't follow the logic. Largest doesn't mean first. I suppose he could be suggesting that because the body of literature is so large, it must have taken a longer time to put it together? But since not all literature of the ancient world has been preserved, and different cultures have preserved different parts of their literature for different reasons and in different percentages, we can't measure literary output by what literature just so happens to be extant today. Having more of something doesn't prove its antiquity. It just means you happen to have more of it.
And yet we are told that this was a literature of nomadic people and primitive people, which there's no reason to preserve that type of literature in any case.
Who says the literature was preserved by primitive nomads? No one that I know of. Besides, we know why the literature of India was preserved. Because it was considered sacred. And it was preserved to this day because the religious tradition that considered it sacred has survived until today. Is this not a universally accepted conclusion?
So the point I raised in one of my earlier books, it's been elevated to something now people sometimes call Frawley's paradox. India has the largest literature from the ancient world. It has the largest archaeological evidence, urban sites from the ancient world. Both are centered on what is called the Saraswati River. Why not just connect the two? Then the mystery of a civilization without a literature and a literature without a civilization is solved.
Frawley's paradox, as he calls it, is that historians don't assign the largest body of literature to the largest civilization. But what does geographical area have to do with literary output? Nothing that I can see. What do brick buildings have to do with a writing tradition? Why couldn't people living in wooden structures, and who were spread out in smaller settlements, produce literature? Well, they could, of course. Mud brick architecture and literature are two different kinds of human production. If you believe what he's saying, you would have to deny that the Hebrew Bible was written by the Israelites because, hey, their kingdom was so small. They couldn't have produced such a large work like the Bible. But of course, that's just silly. Surely Frawley realizes that if he associates the Vedas with the urban society of the Harappans, he still has a long non-urban period in India's history after the Harappans. He hasn't eliminated it. That means he either has to accept that a great society can be non-urbanized, or that the society that followed the Harappans was not great. It is possible, for a sophisticated culture to be subsequent to another sophisticated culture.
Then in the Vedic literature, we also have the references of kings.
Okay, but unless we can see evidence of those kings, or any kings for that matter, in the ruins of the Indus River Valley civilization, then there is no link between the Vedas and the Indus River Valley civilization. Show me one of those kings' names written on something that comes from the Indus River Valley civilization. Hey, then you've got something.
We have mentions of great kings and great emperors. Often we have the statement that the king had 100,000 troops, and he conquers 100 cities.
Have we found evidence of emperors in the Indus River Valley civilization? Or armies of 100,000 men? No, we haven't.
And the Greeks, like Alexander had said, they thought India was a very advanced civilization. And there was one of their authors named Megasthenes. He did a book called Indica. It hasn't survived. But one of its passages said, he came about the time of Alexander, that he found a history in India of 153 kings going back more than 6,400 years.
Yeah, this Greek Megasthenes, who lived around 300 BCE, is purported to have had a list of kings going back more than 6,000 years. And Plato said that Athens had an empire going back 9,000 years. Guess what? It didn't. If Frawley was interested in studying Indian history in the same manner that historians study the histories of all other societies, then he would have to admit that it is very common for histories, which were written centuries after the events they describe, to be expanded, exaggerated, twisted for propaganda purposes, and sometimes just plain wrong because of poor transmission. Why would India be any different? I know his answer: because India is superior to all other cultures. Well, historians can't be biased like that. They have to be consistent. And they should be criticized if they aren't consistent.
And in the Puranas, in the Vedas, we have lists of kings. Puranic king lists are over 100, there's well over 100 kings before the time of Buddha anyway, maybe even close to 150, I don't know the exact numbers involved. India has the longest king list of any culture in the world, much longer than the Egyptians. In the Bible, they only have 42 kings between Abraham and Jesus.
The Puranas are not from Vedic times and contain material that originally was transmitted orally through a bardic tradition, shaped and reshaped over generations until finally written down. We can see how the Puranas contradict the Vedas and thus know that the Puranic traditions altered earlier histories. The Catholic Church has a list of popes going all the way back to the Apostle Peter, but those lists post-date the time of Peter. They are not contemporary with Peter. Therefore, historians rightly approach them with a certain amount of skepticism. How would the king lists, which also are not contemporary, be any different?
And one of the things I did, it's still in my book, Gods, Sages, and Kings, I cataloged there's over 150 references to Samudra, or ocean, in Rig Veda itself. Not only 150 references, there's a heavenly ocean, there's the Antariksha as the ocean, atmospheric ocean, earthly ocean, there's 2 oceans, there's 4 oceans, there's the metaphor of Shataritra, the ship with the 100 oars, there's travel on the sea, there's also travel on the sea where Vashishta prays, there's water all around me and I can't drink. Why? Because it's salt water in the ocean. So the mythology or the image of the ocean pervades the Vedas, and it pervades the symbolism of both the gods and the rishis.
Yes, the symbolism of the sea is often seen in the Vedas. But now, if we were to demonstrate that the people who composed the hymns of the Rig Veda lived near the sea, what evidence would we need to provide? Would simple references to the sea in the Rig Veda be sufficient? No, of course not, because we would need to demonstrate not merely that these people knew of the sea, but that it was in their land. Knowledge of the sea is not the same as proximity to the sea. Well, how would they know about the sea if they never lived there? In many ways, travelers and migrants could have passed on such information. Ancestors could have passed down such information. Indeed, it is highly unlikely that a people on the move would never have heard of the sea. As they are today, people then were fascinated to hear about faraway places. Moreover, it is well known that the ancient peoples living in the area from the Mediterranean to South Asia had a belief that the earth was surrounded by an ocean, that there was an ocean in heaven, and that there was an ocean under the earth. It was part of their cosmology. We can see this, for example, in the myths of the Greeks, the Levantines, the Mesopotamians, and Persians. To demonstrate that the Rigvedic people lived near the sea, we would need more than mere references to the ocean in mythology. We would need unambiguous references to it being in the region where these people resided. And if they did reside by the sea, it would be a major part of their way of life. and so it is highly unlikely that they wouldn't be constantly talking about it. How many of Frawley's 150 references fit that criterion? None that I can see. A great number of them refer to the creation of the world out of the sea. Other myths about the gods also mention the sea. On occasion, the gods Varuna and Soma and Indra are called samudras, which means seas, or at least large bodies of water. Samudra means literally gathering of water. The gods travel in ships in the heavenly sea, and there's reference to divine boats of 100 oars. But these are as mythical as the gods' 1,000 pillared houses and Indra's 1,000 testicles. The numbers 100 and 1,000 are frequently used in the literature as a symbol of the god's greatness. Sometimes the Rig Veda uses the sea symbolically, but nothing about everyday life by the sea or humans traveling on the literal ocean. His comment about a verse in the Rig Veda concerning Vasishtha interested me greatly when I first heard it. If, after all, we have a reference to Vasishtha being in the midst of waters and being unable to drink it because it was salt water, that would be a strong piece of evidence. So I looked it up. Here's what the verse says. Let me not, King Varuna, enter into the house of clay. Have mercy, spare me, mighty Lord. When, Thunderer, I move along tremulous like a wind-blown skin, have mercy, spare me, mighty Lord. Bright and powerful God, through want of strength I erred and went astray. Have mercy, spare me, mighty Lord. Thirst found your worshipper, though he stood in the midst of water fields. I guess that's like fjords? Have mercy, spare me, mighty Lord. Varuna, whatever the offense may be which we as men commit against the heavenly host, when through our want of thought we violate your laws, punish us not, God, for that iniquity. The pertinent line here, of course, is the one about thirst. I don't read Sanskrit, so I can't tell you exactly what word is translated water fields, but I do know it isn't samudra, the word for a large body of water. If you know the literal meaning of the word, please let me know in the comments below. It would make things a lot easier if it said something about the salt. As it is, it's possible that the author means he can't drink the water for some reason, whether because of salt or something else. But it's also plausible that he refuses to drink while thirsty. The poem is about the author's poor state of mind as a result of his transgression. He is forlorn and speaks of wandering aimlessly, deliberately not seeking shelter, even though that causes him to suffer. So it makes sense that just as he refuses to find comfort in a house, so he also refuses to find comfort in satisfying his thirst. In fact, that was the first thing I thought when I read it. Whether you prefer to interpret this as his being unable to drink or being unwilling to drink, you have to admit that the saltwater interpretation is not the only viable one. It therefore cannot constitute proof that the Rigvedic culture resided near saltwater.
Climate is the seasons of India. Monsoon is a very big symbolism. In the Vedic text, you don't have a monsoon in Central Asia. Indra is the monsoon deity releasing the rivers. The monsoon is connected to the summer solstice, which is also when it occurs in India.
The Rig Veda mentions rains, not monsoons. What we would need to see is reference to the winds reversing to bring the rains. That's a monsoon. But as far as I'm aware, this is not mentioned in the Rig Veda. I looked in Frawley's book, Gods, Sages, and Kings, to see what evidence he provides of monsoons, and his basic argument is that since Indra is a monsoon god, and Indra is mentioned in the Rig Veda, then there must have been monsoons then. But you see, he's not taking into consideration the possibility that Indra, who was a storm god, became associated with the monsoons after the people migrated into India. He just assumes that Indra is and has always been associated with the monsoons throughout the entirety of Indian history. But mythology about gods grows and changes over time and is adapted to the people's living circumstances.
Geographically, Vedas talk of a region of Sapta Sindhu. But if you look at Sapta Sindhu, there are three rivers that they mention give the most predominance to: Sindhu, Saraswati, and Sarayu. And it's very easy to identify these at the Sarayu in the east of India, the Saraswati in the center, and the Indus in the west. Some Western scholars tried to put Saraswati and Sarayu in Afghanistan because there are rivers in Afghanistan with connections to these Vedic names, because you also had these in the Iranian culture. But we also have a history of Purus and Ikshwakus conquering, moving to Afghanistan. And because these rivers are said to be oceanic and huge, in the case of the Saraswati flowing all the way into the sea, we cannot identify them with the rivers of Afghanistan.
The term Sapta Sindhu means 7 rivers, and refers to the land in which the people of the Rig Veda lived. Mainstream scholars equate this area with the region called the Punjab. Several of the rivers mentioned in the Rig Veda cannot be identified with certainty. There appears to have been a practice among migrating peoples to name new rivers they encountered after rivers they remembered from back home. For example, although there is a Saraswati River in India, there was definitely one also in Afghanistan. While scholars are inclined to think of the one in Afghanistan as being named first, Frawley prefers to think of the original rivers as existing in India, and then people migrating westward took the names with them and applied them in Afghanistan. Whatever the case, it's probable that the rivers referred to in the Rig Veda are in most cases the ones in India, and that is where Rigvedic society is to be located, so there's no problem there. Frawley wishes to make the Sarayu River one of the main rivers of the Rig Veda, though it is mentioned only 3 times. It's not one of the chief rivers of early Vedic culture. The Drishatwati and Shatudri are far more important. There is a Sarayu River today in northern India, but without warrant, he uses this river name to stretch the eastern boundary of Vedic territory all the way to the Bay of Bengal. Mainstream scholars are generally agreed that the Sarayu is a tributary of the Indus River, because it is listed in the Rig Veda along with the other tributaries of the Indus.
Saraswati was a great river of India that dried up around 4,000 years ago. Most of these so-called Harappan or Indus Valley sites are actually located on the dry banks of the Saraswati River, showing there was once water that was located there. For those who know the Vedic text, in Rig Veda, Saraswati is a great river flowing into the sea. In late Vedic text in the Mahabharata, there's the Vinashana of the Saraswati, where it dries up in the desert. And then later on, Saraswati is not mentioned at all. So all stages of the drying up of the river are also there.
The Saraswati River is given more praise in the Rig Veda than any other river, even the Indus, though this need not mean it was the largest river, but only that it was important to the Rigvedic people. The Rig Veda describes the Saraswati as flowing through the high mountains into a samudra, a large body of water. It's usually identified with the modern Sarsuti, Gagar, and Hakra rivers. That is, they all once were connected. The upper course of the Saraswati is in the Punjab, right where mainstream scholars situate the Rigvedic society. Although it's smaller than it used to be, it still exists today. Now, because Frawley not only wants to push the date of the Rig Veda back, but also extend Rigvedic society southward to the ocean, he emphasizes the fact that the river ran through the region where the Harappan civilization existed, and that during the pre-Harappan period appears to have been significantly large on its lower course, though there is some dispute on that point. It's all dried up today. Settlements were being built directly on the floodplain of the Gagar-Hakra River in the mature Harappan period, which shows that it was no longer a major river at that time anyway. Maybe I'm missing it, but I haven't heard anything from Frawley that conclusively shows that the Rigvedic people lived on the lower course of the river. In other words, I'm not seeing any evidence that invalidates the current scholarly consensus of the location or the time of the Rigvedic culture.
Harappa represents the late Vedic culture in which the river was in decline, like the time of Mahabharata. So the ocean-going Saraswati represents an earlier period. So even if the Saraswati was in decline in the Harappan era, that doesn't disprove the Vedic literature. Actually, it gives it a greater antiquity.
The problem with dating the later Vedas to the Harappan period is that there are explicit references to iron in them. And our earliest evidence of iron technology in India is around 1200 BCE, after the disappearance of the Harappan civilization. The later Vedas, not the Rig Veda, but the later Vedas, which mention iron, must therefore come after 1200 BCE.
the flora and the fauna of the Vedas. Peepal tree is common, Ashwata tree. So you know what the Western scholars say? Ashwata was originally the aspen tree in Central Asia, and when they came to India, they took that name and gave it to the Ashwata tree. So even if you have the evidence, then they negate the evidence by changing the meaning of terms in order to suit them.
Frawley here refers to the peepal, or sacred fig tree, also known as the Bodhi tree, which is native to South Asia and Southeast Asia. It is mentioned in the Atharva Veda all the time, less so in the Rig Veda. I believe it's in a mere 4 hymns out of over 1,000, but it is still in there. So wouldn't that indicate that the Rig Veda was composed in India? Well, it would indicate that at least by the time those 4 hymns of the Rig Veda were composed, the people had now entered the territory in which the peepal tree could be found. What the exact limits of the people's domain were in those days, we can't know for certain. But I'm pretty sure the peepal tree is in the region of the Punjab today.
And then there's this whole issue of what we call the soma.
Soma is the name of a plant and of a drink made from that plant, which was and is used in religious ritual.
So I did an extensive study of soma in the Rig Veda and in other texts. In the Charak, in Sushrut Samhita, I think it is, 24 different types of somas are listed in their locations. And substitute somas, they exist in the mountains, they grow near mountain lakes, they have abundant milk and juice, and they're described as various orchid-type plants or lotus lily-type plants, and certain reed-type plants. So the types of plants. And there's many types of soma. And even if you study this sukta, this Vedic sukta, the Rig Vedic sukta on the hymn to the plants, soma dwells in all the plants. Soma is the rasa, or the healing essence of the plants.
Because the practice of making soma has continued in different lands and to the present day, and over time different plants have been used to make the drink, identifying the original plant has proved tricky, and there are always new proposals being made. The word soma in Sanskrit is a cognate of the Avestan word haoma. Avestan is the language of the Zoroastrian scriptures, an early Iranian language. That soma and haoma are cognates, that is, words that have a common etymological origin, is beyond dispute. Soma and haoma, they're referring to the same thing. How would we figure out what the plant was? Well, both the Rig Veda and the Avesta provide clues by giving descriptions of the plants, of the making of the drink, and of the effects of the drink upon consumption. We don't have time to go over all the details. I will just tell you that the majority of scholars are inclined to identify the plant as ephedra. It just seems to fit the descriptions best. Remains of ephedra have been found in a ritual context in Margiana. But because ephedra is native to Central Asia, and a bunch of other places for that matter, but not native to India, Frawley cannot abide this conclusion. And because he cannot identify a more likely candidate which is native to India, he argues instead that soma is not an identifiable plant at all, but is merely, quote, the healing essence in every plant, unquote. The main problem with Frawley's approach is that he uses sources from across a fairly long time period to establish that the descriptions of soma are varied. So for example, when he says there were 24 varieties, that was in the time of Sushruta, centuries after Rigvedic times. In other words, this approach conflates many definitions of soma and many practices associated with soma into one. But the descriptions given of the plant in the Rig Veda and Avesta, our oldest sources on soma, are specific enough to be the characteristics of a single plant, maybe 2. Frawley argues that ephedra doesn't fit the Rigvedic description, because, if I understand him, the Rig Veda says soma is a wet plant, and ephedra is a dry plant. Okay, maybe it's not ephedra. There are other possibilities. Or the Rigvedic Society had already chosen a new plant to replace the old soma. The identification of soma is not an important pillar in the argument that the Indo-Aryans came from Central Asia. It can't be, because there's still considerable debate as to what soma was. By toppling the claim that soma was ephedra, Frawley isn't really accomplishing that much.
And more recent archaeology in Haryana has now discovered these Harappan sites and pre-Harappan sites of agriculture going back to 7000 BC.
It's true that agriculture goes that far back in India, and although India probably invented agriculture independently, it still was after it was invented in the Near East.
The main grain is yava, or barley, at an earlier phase. That's also there in Rig Veda.
Yes, the staple crop of Rigvedic society was barley. Guess what the staple crop of the Harappan civilization was? Wheat. Not a match. In the late Harappan period, they started cultivating rice. Rice is also absent in the Rig Veda.
What we have to understand is that the literature we have cannot be regarded as exhaustive of everything. The Rig Veda has been preserved, but that doesn't mean there weren't other texts at that time. And we cannot look to what is essentially a spiritual religious text for every aspect of the life of the people. If a plant is not mentioned in the Rig Veda, people didn't know about it.
And just because a plant is not mentioned, that doesn't mean people did know about it.
So some of the Western linguists have said, look, there are no horses on the seals, therefore they couldn't be Vedic people.
The Rig Veda is full of references to horses, horse-drawn chariots and horse races, and speaks of even non-nobles riding horses. But horses are notably absent from the material remains of the Harappan civilization. Our earliest evidence of horse domestication, by the way, comes from Central Asia.
Since 90% of the seals are unicorns, there are no unicorns in India, then they must have lived in a land where they were unicorns. In other words, their iconography was symbolic. It was not a zoological set of specimen.
Yes, it may be that the Harappan images include both mythical and real animals, but you still can't say that horses were a major part of Harappan civilization unless you have evidence of the horses. Show us the horses.
And it's interesting because we have multi-headed animals in the symbols. We have animals with unusual body parts, like the tail of a snake and the arms of a deer, and then the head of an elephant, things like that. But if you look at the iconography in Rig Veda, you have the same thing. Not exactly in terms of the symbol, but you have like Chatwari Shringa, but with 4 horns, 3 feet, 2 heads, and 7 hands.
We can find weird animal depictions anywhere. The question is whether the animals match. They do not.
And the other one that's common is the three-hump bull. And the Trikakut, the 3-hump bull, is a common symbol in Rig Veda.
I looked all over for an image of a 3-humped bull in the Harappan images on the seals that we have. I haven't been able to find one, but maybe I'm missing it. So if anyone can find me an image of a 3-humped bull from the Harappan culture, I would greatly appreciate it.
And then in the Vedas, even in Rig Veda, there are certain battles going on. And there are the battles between what are called so-called Aryas and Dasyus, or Dasas. So the Western scholars said, okay, this is the incoming Aryans versus the native Dravidian people. Aryans are suspect because they're connected to Jyoti, or light, and the sun, so they must be fair-skinned people. Dasyus are connected to darkness, and so they must be dark-skinned people. And if you look throughout the Rig Veda, there's a certain struggle between the northern peoples, like the Purus, and the southern people, like Yadus, which we also have historically mentioned. In other words, these other Vedic people, Anus, Druyus, etc., could also be called Dasyus or Dasas. It had nothing to do with race or ethnicity. It was a matter of terminology.
Soma is symbolic, animals are symbolic, dasas are symbolic. It's so easy to dismiss evidence by calling it symbolic, isn't it? Historians fully acknowledge that the dasas, or dasyu, are portrayed in a half-mythical fashion. They're called devils and demons, after all. But that doesn't mean every description of them is fictitious. Let's take a look at the references in the Rig Veda about the dasas being dark, and you tell me whether you think it sounds literal, like they have dark skin, or symbolic, that they are dark only in an evil sense. Indra made the black skin subject, driving away the black skin. Blow away the black skin hateful to Indra. Note that the color of the skin of the dasas is specifically referred to here. Some have pointed out that the word skin sometimes can refer to the surface of the earth, and they suggest that perhaps that is how the word skin is being used in these instances. Maybe, but since it is the less common definition of the word, I would say it is less likely.
And then the funniest one they did is they said that, okay, these Arya people are fighting Dasyus who are Shishnadevas. They worship the Phalos. And therefore they must be indigenous Dravidian Shaivites. And they are also said to have anasa. They are said to have low-nosed. So they are the low-nosed indigenous people. There are 2 references of this type in 1,000 hymns of Rig Veda. So then the interesting thing, I researched those out, and the Dasyus who are anasa are also apada and ahasta. They have no feet, and they have no hands, and they have no nose. What kind of people are these? It's a description of a serpent.
This argument has some validity when we're talking about the low noses. If the lack of feet and hands are not to be taken literally, then yes, perhaps the low noses aren't either. But that doesn't give you an excuse to dismiss all descriptions of the dasas. Skin color and religion are not coordinate with body parts. I don't see the logic in the argument that because they're said to have no feet and hands, then we shouldn't believe the Rig Veda that they worship the phallus. Doesn't really go. I mean, let's say your position is that the dark skin is not literal, but only a symbol of the evil of the land of the dasas. If darkness is associated with evil, how would that imagery not carry over into real life when literal dark-skinned people were encountered? We know that darker-skinned people in India exist. How is it that literal dark skin in Indian history came to represent inferiority long before Europeans ever came there? How did that come about? There is only one reasonable explanation for the variety of skin colors in India: that people of different ethnic backgrounds intermingled. That's the only possibility. You can't say that darker-skinned and lighter-skinned people just happened to develop side by side in the same locality. That makes no genetic sense. And given the fact that movement of people into India is documented through historical times and to the present day, it's unreasonable to suppose that no migration into India could have occurred earlier. Genetic research has shown that the variation in skin colors in India were due not merely to what altitudes people lived at, but also where they came from. It shows also that the light skin gene found in South Asians is the same one found in Europeans.
If we look at the artifacts of the Harappan civilization, the most common geometrical symbol they use is the swastika. Okay. They also have the peepal leaf. They have all the basic motifs of the Indian art. And they also have a lot of fire altars. Fire altars are common. And if we look at the symbolism of the writing, they have the chakra symbol is very common. We have very common the Pashupati, which is the yogi sitting in meditation pose with animals around him. And what do the leftist scholars say? Oh no, you can't identify him with Shiva. Shiva came so much later in time, we cannot connect these images. It could be some shamanic figure. Even though he has 3 heads and the same group of animals that he has later times. So even the symbols and the artifacts, we have a Vedic connection.
Since historians accept that the Harappan culture may have influenced later Vedic culture, none of what Frawley is saying here contradicts their view. If he wants to demonstrate that the Harappan and Vedic cultures are identical, that is, that they are from the same time period, then merely showing similarity of symbols or practices is not enough. The swastika, fire altars, chakra symbol, meditation poses existed in India for millennia. He needs something to anchor the Vedas specifically in the Harappan time period.
There were some earlier also criticisms of the Vedic literature. They say Vedic literature mentions ayas or iron, and therefore it must come from later period. If we look at Rig Veda, Ayas is compared to Hiranya, or gold in luster. And in many of the other Indo-European languages, Ayas means copper, or at most bronze.
He's right. The word ayas probably means copper or bronze. And that being the case, the appearance of that word in the Rig Veda does not mean it has to come from the Iron Age. However, the earliest evidence of bronze working in India is about 3000 BCE, copper too. Yet Frawley dates the Rig Veda, which mentions bronze, to well before 3000 BCE, thousands of years before. He says it doesn't fit the Iron Age, but then puts it in the Stone Age. I don't get that. I should add that the Rig Veda makes mention of ruined cities, but not presently existing ones, other than those of the gods. How then could Rig Vedic society exist before cities were built?
In fact, now we know that iron technology, India was one of the main sources of that. Steel also came from India.
The earliest evidence of ironworking and steelmaking has been found in Anatolia, not India.
And then the other interesting thing they found out is that in the 15th century in Syria, there was a group of people called the Mitanni who had Sanskritic names and the Sanskritic language. So part of the Aryan invasion scenario is that this was the Vedic people on their way to India. It has several problems. One, they had a literature, for example, of manuals of training horses, which was almost in pure Sanskrit. Two, they were a nobility. They were the Maryada. They were the noble kings and aristocracy of the region. They weren't nomads at all. They weren't primitive people at all. They were the highest level of the aristocracy.
While Mitanni had a language that was related to Sanskrit, it was not, as Frawley claims, almost pure Sanskrit. There are typical features of Sanskrit that are completely absent from Mitanni, and in fact absent from all Indo-European languages west of India. If Sanskrit had been the original language, how is it possible that all Western languages that supposedly came from it lost these typical features? It's far more likely that the typical features of Sanskrit are innovations to an earlier language rather than original, and that is why they can only be found in India.
There were also related Indo-European people, what they were connected with, like Hittites, Kassites, also were ruling Mesopotamia at that particular time, and all of them appear as urban, princely elite, not as any primitive people. And if we trace the movement, we see these people are always moving to the west. They are not going to the east. And they continued there as well.
The Hittites didn't speak an Indo-Aryan language. I'm not sure where he's getting that from. It's true that the princely elites of the Mitanni and of the Kassites seem to have spoken an Indo-Aryan language. But the common people, the masses, did not. Most of the Mitanni spoke Hurrian, and most of the Mesopotamians, where the Kassites ruled, spoke Akkadian. And when Mitanni fell, and Kassite rule ended, their languages disappeared with them. So these cannot be used as evidence that the Indo-Aryan language spread westward and evolved into the rest of the Indo-European languages.
And even later, when the Persians and the Scythians came in, they were also groups connected to all these people. And not only that, the Sanskrit they were using appears to be a later Sanskrit, not an earlier Sanskrit.
These are claims which have not been sufficiently demonstrated with evidence.
But it's clear that we have room for people moving outside of India as well. And it's also interesting that the closer they are to India, the more Vedic the culture is, the further away they are, Vedic tends to be removed.
Well, of course. That would be the case whether they migrated east or west.
If you study the Zend-Avesta, the homeland of the Persians is Balkh, or Bactria, not the west. And Balkh is also mentioned in the Atharva Veda and other texts. The Persian name for fire is Atar, priests are Atharvas. So they went, and Arata was the name they used to call that part of Syria and Turkey, even today, Urartu, Arata. So we have even literary evidence of the westward movement of those people involved.
Please keep in mind that just because scholars believe that Indo-Iranians migrated eastward into India, this doesn't mean that people could only ever have moved in an easterly direction at any time for any reason.
And then we have also astronomical references in Vedic text. In the earlier times, they talked about, India, you have this solely lunar calendar. But you have references to earlier dates of solstices and equinox. Atharva Veda, and when the last book has a very interesting hymn, they start out the list of nakshatras with Kritika, and then they use the term ayana, which means solstice, and the ayana is Magha. When Kritika is the vernal equinox, ayana is the summer solstice is in Magha. That it can be very easily dated to a period of around 2500 to 2000 BCE. We have a lot of references to Kritika equinox and even to ones before them.
A quick primer on the Vedas and astronomy. Observations of heavenly phenomena in the Vedas are scarce. We do get the impression that the composers were interested in what was going on in the sky, mostly in the sense of marveling at nature. They rarely do it in a direct manner, as for example, providing data in a scientific sense. We find references to the heavenly bodies in religious hymns to the sun, the moon, and the stars. You don't find much interest in making mathematical calculations from the heavenly observations. There's nothing systematic about it that we feel justified in calling it mathematical astronomy. So the modern practice of using the Vedas to make precise mathematical calculations about chronology is bound to be fraught with problems. You heard Frawley use the word kritika. This is a nakshatra mentioned in the Vedas. What's a nakshatra? In early Vedic poems, nakshatra is just a generic word for a star. In later Vedic literature, a nakshatra is a special grouping of stars in a list of 27 or 28 sacred groupings, which represent the groupings of stars the moon passes in a given month. Kritika is one of the few nakshatras we can identify. It corresponds to the group of stars that we today call the Pleiades. What Frawley is referring to is how, due to the precession or backward tilting of the Earth's polar axis, the fixed background of stars in the sky keeps on changing, and the equinoxes and solstices over time gradually shift with respect to the background of stars. When he speaks of Kritika equinoxes, he refers to the time when during the spring equinox the sun rose with the Kritikas in the background on the eastern horizon, circa 2500 to 2000 BCE, he says. And the sun did indeed arise in Kritika at that time. How does he connect this to the Vedas? His evidence is that the Vedas count their nakshatras from Kritika. In other words, he thinks the nakshatra system was invented at a time when Kritika came first. And the Shatapatha Brahmana, which is part of the Vedas, speaks of the Kritikas rising in the east, which would indicate that when it was written, the nakshatra system had only recently begun, which would be circa 2500 to 2000 BCE. For his dating to be correct, Frawley assumes first that when the Kritikas are said to have appeared in the east, they did so exactly on the eastern horizon with no deviation from the center and exactly at the celestial equator, 0 degrees Taurus, as if the inventors of the nakshatra system happened to create it at the perfect moment in time. I think it's more reasonable to assume that this was a general observation that the sun rose near the Pleiades, without any special measurement being taken. Noting the exact position of that star group wasn't necessary in order for the calendar to work because their calendar was not based on the stars. He's very big on the equinox, but the Kritikas in the Rig Veda are associated more commonly with the moon rather than the sun. All evidence indicates that the early Vedic calendar was lunar. A solar year and a sidereal year, that's a star year, are 365 days long, but a lunar calendar is 360 days long. 360 are the days of the year. So great is the year. The Lord of creation is the year. The sacrifice is the Lord of creation. Soma, that's the moon. The king is the year. Coming with the seasons, he approaches. The moon is king of the year. The fact that their year was 360 days long suggests 12 months of 30 days each, which means that their lunar year was approximate, not exact. A true lunar year is only 354 days, 8 hours, 48 minutes, 34 seconds. This is not to say that the Vedic people didn't observe the sun or the stars and make certain general calculations based on their movements. It's only to say that their calendar year was based on the movement of the moon primarily and not on the movement of the sun or the stars. To make things even more tricky, many different sacred calendars developed in India, and it's hard to track the histories of all of them. We do know that many of them brought the lunar year into harmony with the solar year by adding an extra month every few years. It's reasonable to suppose that they did a system of intercalation, that's what they call it, fairly early on. There may even be evidence of it in the Rig Veda, but exactly how it was done is not known. Frawley's approach is merely to retroject the later, fully developed system onto the Vedas and assume that it was consistent throughout time. I think that's too credulous. Well, what if the Vedic calendar did originate when Kritika rose at the beginning of the year in the east? And what if we assume that this was a rough observation and not a precise one? When would that place it? Well, it could have been as late as the mid-second millennium BCE. Even in the case of a time when the moon rose at the beginning of a month in Kritika, would that necessarily mean that parts of the Vedas were composed at the time such moonrises occurred? No, because it could equally mean that the people who composed the Vedas merely have a memory of those times. Moreover, since a Kritika moonrise could have been observed outside of India, there is nothing in this argument that would pinpoint the location to India. So the astronomical observation of the moonrise has no bearing on the question of the Aryan migration.
So what does the Western translator say? Hindus aren't good astronomers even today. Why should we trust that they were good astronomers even then? This information has absolutely no value whatsoever. Yet if we read the text, they also speak of it. But how can you have a calendar that doesn't work? How could you be following a watch that is no longer running?
Their lunar calendar did work, and their observation of the stars had little to do with the calendar.
The Aryan myth is still going on. The Europeans would still like to be the original Aryans. The Germans would like it. The Russians would also like to have that title for themselves, so they are not giving up on nationalistic grounds.
Huh? How can this possibly be true when scholars say that both Europeans and Indians have common ancestors? That puts them on equal footing.
There has been a concerted movement to denigrate the native culture of India. It happened throughout the world. Native Americans were totally denigrated. We grew up with the image of Native Americans as massacring poor white immigrants. The opposite occurred. The white immigrants and armies massacred the poor Native Americans. It's time for that colonial scenario to change. India is the only country that's maintaining the colonial anti-native scenario of its own culture, even though it has the most magnificent of the native cultures and has been able to preserve its native culture the best. So that is why this issue needs to be addressed and to be changed.
Can Frawley present evidence that the current theory, the Aryan migration theory, presently promotes colonialism? If so, I would like to see it. All he has shown in this talk is how an old theory was used to promote colonialism back in the days of colonialism.
And finally, I was told by some of the Western scholars, yes, we know our Aryan scenario is incorrect, but we don't know what else to put there, and until we do, we're going to leave it there.
This is similar to climate change deniers pointing to a couple of scientists who depart from the consensus as proof that the consensus is wrong. Anyway, these two videos have been quite long, and if you stayed all the way to the end, I applaud you and thank you very much. So much more could even be said on this, and maybe I will revisit the topic one day. But don't worry, we'll be moving to another part of the world next time. If you'd like to see the next episode of Myths of Ancient History, please hit the subscribe button and the bell, and you'll be notified when it comes out. We'll see you next time, everybody.